The spoon clinked against the porcelain rim as I stirred honey into my tea, standing just outside the kitchen doorway. The afternoon light filtered through Sarah's gauze curtains, casting soft patterns on the hardwood floor I had helped refinish last summer. Through the gap in the doorway, I could see my daughter's back, phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing as she spoke in the low, confidential tone she used for her closest friends. "She's a burden." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, heavy and acrid. The refrigerator hummed its steady tune, the same rhythm it had kept for the 3 years I had lived in this house. Afternoon light slanted through the window above the sink, catching dust motes that danced, oblivious to the way the world had just shifted on its axis. My hand stilled on the spoon, honey swirling in amber spirals through the cooling tea. Time stretched thin as pulled taffy, and in that suspended moment, I felt something inside me shift, not break, but realign, like a door finally finding its proper frame after years of hanging crooked. The kitchen I had painted last spring, soft yellow like early daffodils, chosen because Sarah said it would make the room feel bigger, suddenly felt like a courtroom where the verdict had been delivered without my presence. Burden. The word rolled around in my mind, testing its weight, its texture. 6 letters that somehow contained the total of 3 years of careful living, of making myself useful, of trying to earn my place in a family I had thought I already belonged to. I had carried groceries up these stairs when my arthritis flared. I had folded mountains of laundry on this very counter, sorting tiny clothes by size and season. I had kissed scraped knees at this table, made countless peanut butter sandwiches, and paid for half the utilities without being asked. But I was a burden. Sarah's voice continued, animated now as she described some logistical challenge to whoever was on the other end of the line. Something about Emma's daycare schedule, about her job interview next week, about the stress of managing everything. Her tone carried the particular exhaustion of a single mother who had been carrying too much for too long, but also something else, a casualness in dismissing me that spoke of conversations I had never heard, discussions where my presence in this house had been dissected and found wanting. I set the teacup on the small table in the hallway with the kind of care you use when handling something that might shatter, or something that has already shattered and you're only just now noticing the cracks. The afternoon light seemed different now, sharper and more honest, illuminating truths I had been walking around for months like furniture in a dark room. Love had become a ledger, and I was always in the red. I remembered the day I moved in here, 3 years ago, after Harold passed. Sarah had stood in the doorway of the same kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed from the funeral, Emma balanced on her hip, both of them looking lost in the way people do when death rearranges all their plans. "Just for a little while," she had said, her voice small and uncertain. "Until you figure things out. Until we both figure things out." I had sold the house Harold and I had shared for 32 years, our house, with the garden he had tended and the workshop where he had built Emma's first dollhouse. The realtor said it was too big for one person, too much maintenance, too many memories. The money sat in a savings account now, earning modest interest while I earned my keep through endless small services and the careful management of my own needs. Just for a little while had stretched into seasons, then years. The guest room became my room, though we all still called it the guest room, as if naming it honestly would make my presence too permanent, too presumptuous. My books found shelves between picture frames of a family I was part of but somehow outside of. I learned the rhythm of this house: coffee before 7, lunches packed by 8:15, dinner at 6:30 sharp unless Sarah was working late, in which case I would feed Emma and keep a plate warm in the oven. I slipped into the spaces left for me, making myself useful in the way that water finds the lowest ground. I took on the tasks that no one else wanted, emptying the dishwasher, folding fitted sheets, and remembering when the car registration was due. I made myself necessary and, I thought, appreciated. I made myself small enough to fit into the corners of a life that wasn't quite mine but was the closest thing I had to home. The signs had been there, subtle as shifting weather patterns. Sarah's small sighs when I asked about adjusting the thermostat. The way she closed her laptop when I entered the room, as if her work were too important or too private for my eyes. How conversations between her and her friends would pause when I appeared, then resume in a different key, like a song modulated to a minor chord. The way Emma's bedtime stories became shorter when I wasn't the one reading them, as if my granddaughter's attention span decreased when her mother was eager to reclaim her evening. I told myself it was an adjustment, the natural growing pains of 3 generations learning to live under one roof. I told myself I was helping, that my presence made Sarah's life easier, that Emma benefited from having her grandmother close by. I told myself that the small tensions were temporary, that we were building something new and beautiful together, a modern family structure that worked for everyone. But children don't lie in whispers to friends on phones. They tell the truth they can't say to your face, the truth that sits in their chest like a stone until it finds a way out when they think no one is listening. Burden. I walked upstairs to my room, the guest room, and pulled my suitcase from the closet shelf. It smelled like cedar sachets and old travels, from the days when Harold and I would drive to Oregon to visit his sister Margaret, back when we had routines that belonged to us and places where we were expected. My hands moved with surprising steadiness as I folded clothes into neat squares, the muscle memory of decades of packing for trips that had purpose and destination. 3 years of living small meant everything fit easily. I had learned to keep my possessions minimal, my impact light. The winter coats could stay, they were practical gifts from Sarah, chosen more for function than sentiment. The extra blankets she had bought when I first moved in stayed folded in the chair by the window. I took my books, the ones with my handwriting in the margins, and bookmarks made from old birthday cards. I took my jewelry, Harold's watch, and the ceramic bowl he had made in that pottery class he'd taken to surprise me for our anniversary. I took the things that knew my name. Downstairs, I could hear Sarah still talking, her voice animated now as she discussed dinner plans with someone who wasn't me, someone who apparently merited consultation about evening meals. I wrote a note on the pad by the kitchen phone, the same pad where I had been leaving grocery lists and appointment reminders for 3 years. But what do you say when love has been weighed and found wanting? Thank you for letting me know where I stand. Sorry for being such a burden. Love, the woman who used to be your mother? The words looked ridiculous on paper, inadequate to the magnitude of what was shifting. I tore the note into small pieces and dropped them in the trash can under the sink, the one I had emptied every Tuesday morning for 3 years as part of the invisible labor that kept this household running. Instead, I placed my house key on the counter, next to the coffee maker I had bought when theirs broke last winter. It sat there like a small surrender, a white flag made of metal and resignation. The front door closed behind me with a soft click, not a slam. Drama would have felt false, like performing grief for an audience that wasn't watching. I had painted that door too, sage green like the herbs I had planted in boxes on the porch, rosemary and thyme and basil that no one used for cooking but that made the entrance smell like hope and growing things. My car sat in the driveway where it had lived for 3 years, patient as an old dog waiting for a walk that never came. I put my suitcase in the trunk and sat behind the wheel, looking up at the window of what had been my room. The afternoon light made the glass look golden, like a painting of domestic tranquility. Sarah appeared there, phone still pressed to her ear, and our eyes met through the glass. Her expression shifted in slow motion, confusion melting into recognition, then crystallizing into something that might have been panic or relief or both. She raised her hand toward the window, a gesture that could have been a wave or a plea to wait, a request for time to finish her conversation and come downstairs to explain. I lifted my own hand in return, a gentle goodbye that held no anger, no accusation, no demand for apology or explanation. Then I put the car in reverse and drove away from the house where I had learned that love could be rationed, that family could be conditional, that home was not always a place where you belonged simply by virtue of being yourself. The motel I found sat off the interstate, the kind of place that advertised clean sheets and reasonable rates in block letters on a sign that had seen better decades. My room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking a parking lot where the evening light painted ordinary cars in shades of gold and amber. It smelled like industrial lemon cleaner and fresh possibility, like anonymous comfort and the radical luxury of space that belonged, however temporarily, to me alone. I sat on the bed, firm, anonymous, mine for the night, and let the silence settle around me like a familiar coat. There was no television chatter in the background, no sounds of other people's needs calling from other rooms. Just the hum of the air conditioning unit and the distant sound of highway traffic, the white noise of a world that didn't require my participation or management. The television remote sat on the nightstand, and I picked it up experimentally, like a tool I had forgotten how to use. When had I last chosen what to watch? When had my preferences been the deciding factor in anything? I settled on a nature documentary about migration patterns, the narrator's voice calm and authoritative as he described the annual journey of Arctic terns across impossible distances. I thought about being 7 years old, standing in my mother's kitchen while she counted coins for the grocery money. I had wanted to take art classes at the community center, had brought home a flyer decorated with pictures of children painting at easels, their faces bright with creative joy. "Don't be a burden," my mother had said, not unkindly but firmly, folding the flyer in half and setting it aside. "We all do what's needed, not what we want." I learned to need less, speak less, and want less. I learned to find satisfaction in being helpful rather than happy, to measure my worth by how little trouble I caused rather than how much joy I experienced. I married Harold because he was steady and kind and because my mother approved of his practical nature, not because my heart raced when he smiled or because I felt seen in his presence. I loved him, learned to love him the way you learn to love good weather, grateful for its reliability without expecting it to transform your world. When Sarah was born, I poured all my postponed dreams into keeping her safe, keeping her happy, keeping her unburdened by my own unrealized desires. I wanted her to have the confidence I had never developed, the permission to take up space that I had never granted myself. I worked part-time jobs that fit around her schedule, saved money for her college fund while wearing shoes until they fell apart, and celebrated every small victory in her life as if it were my own. And now, 57 years after first being called a burden for wanting art classes, the word had found me again, spoken by the daughter I had tried so hard to protect from its poison. But this time I would let the word belong to the one who said it. My phone buzzed against the nightstand, a text from Sarah. *Mom, where are you? We need to talk. The screen lit up in the growing darkness of the motel room, urgent and demanding in the way that assumed immediate response, immediate availability for whatever crisis required managing. Then another message, please call me. Emma is asking for you. Then, I'm worried. This isn't like you. But it was like me, or like the me I was becoming, the me I had been before I learned to apologize for existing. I turned the phone face down on the nightstand and ran a bath in the small tub, letting the water get hot enough to pink my skin. Steam fogged the mirror above the sink, and I sank into the heat slowly, letting it hold me in a way I hadn't been held in months, maybe years. The water was exactly the temperature I preferred, not adjusted for anyone else's comfort or preference. I could soak until my fingers pruned without anyone needing the bathroom, without someone's schedule requiring my immediate attention. It was a small luxury that felt revolutionary, the simple act of existing in my own time, for my own comfort, without negotiation or compromise. Tomorrow, I will figure out what comes next. Tonight, I will practice being a person instead of a problem. The calls came in waves over the next few days, each voicemail a study in the predictable stages of someone realizing they had lost something they hadn't known they valued. Sarah's voice moved through confusion, irritation, worry, then something that sounded like negotiation, as if my absence were a contract she could rework to more favorable terms. "Mom, I know you're upset, but Emma needs her grandmother. You can't just disappear because of some misunderstanding. She's been crying for you at bedtime and I don't know what to tell her." Misunderstanding. As if I had misheard my own sentencing, as if 3 small words spoken into a phone could be explained away by context or intention. There were practical questions too, delivered in the slightly annoyed tone of someone discovering how much invisible labor had been going unnoticed. Did I take the spare key to the garage? Where were the insurance papers for the car that I had been driving, but that was still technically in both our names? Could I at least call Emma? She was asking for me every morning, wondering when Grandma was coming home. Each message tugged at something deep in my chest, the place where being needed lived alongside being wanted, where love and obligation had become so entangled I could no longer tell them apart. I had been Emma's Tuesday through Thursday grandmother, the one who knew she liked her sandwiches cut diagonally and her stories read with different voices for each character. I knew she was afraid of the vacuum cleaner but loved the blender, that she called ladybugs ladybirds and refused to wear socks that weren't the same color. The thought of her calling for me twisted sharp as a blade between my ribs. But I didn't call back. Instead, I drove to a coffee shop with reliable Wi-Fi and bought a good cup of coffee, not the generic brand I had been drinking for 3 years to save money for household expenses that weren't really mine to manage. I made a list on a paper napkin, the kind of list I should have made months or maybe years ago, things I will do and asterisk things I won't do anymore. Asterisk will do, love my family. Be Emma's grandmother. Help when asked, not when assumed. Visit for scheduled periods with clear beginning and ending times. Contribute to special occasions when invited. Asterisk won't do, live where I'm unwanted. Provide unpaid, unacknowledged labor. Manage crises that aren't mine to solve. Apologize for having needs. Accept being treated as a live-in help rather than family. The list felt both radical and reasonable, like drawing a map to a country I had always wanted to visit but never believed I could reach. Each item was a small revolution, a quiet declaration of independence from the exhausting mathematics of earning love through service. My old friend Janet lived 20 minutes away in a house that smelled like lavender sachets and fresh bread, where books lived in tall stacks beside comfortable chairs and where the coffee was always strong enough to wake the dead. She opened the door before I could knock, as if she had been waiting for 3 years for me to remember I was allowed to ask for help. Tea first, she said, leading me to her kitchen without preamble or questions. Story after. We sat at her round table, painted blue like a summer sky and marked with rings from countless cups and conversations. I told her about the whisper that had broken the room, about the weight of being useful instead of loved, about the way good intentions could slowly erode into resentment when boundaries dissolved and expectations multiplied beyond recognition. Janet listened without offering solutions, just nodding and making small sounds of understanding, refilling my cup when it emptied without asking if I wanted more. She had raised 4 children, mostly alone after her husband died young, had worked 2 jobs, and still managed to make each child feel seen and valued. She understood the difference between helping and self-erasure, between love and martyrdom. You can stay as long as you need, she said finally, as the afternoon light began to fade through her kitchen window. The couch is comfortable, and the quilt is my grandmother's. She made it for her hope chest, but ended up using it to comfort everyone who needed it. There's a support group that meets at the community center on Tuesday nights. Caregivers and former caregivers. People who understand the mathematics of love. That night, wrapped in Janet's grandmother's quilt, I felt something I had almost forgotten, the luxury of being welcome without earning it, of being offered comfort without having to provide anything in return. The couch held me like an embrace, and I slept deeper than I had in months, uninterrupted by the small sounds of other people's needs calling from other rooms. The community center on Tuesday evening buzzed with the quiet energy of people who had found each other across the geography of similar wounds. Folding chairs arranged in a rough circle, coffee in styrofoam cups that warmed your hands while you worked up the courage to speak. The facilitator was a woman about my age with silver hair and gentle eyes who began each session by saying, "This is a place where we practice telling the truth about love." One by one, voices rose and fell like waves against a shore. I didn't know I was allowed to say no. I gave until I forgot what I needed. I thought love meant disappearing into other people's needs. I was so busy being indispensable that I forgot to be a person. Margaret, whose adult son had moved back home after his divorce and treated her like live-in help while he got back on his feet, a process that had stretched into 3 years of laundry service and free meals with no discussion of contribution or timeline. David, who had spent 40 years caring for his partner through chronic illness, losing himself so completely in the role of caregiver that when his partner died, He had to relearn his own name, his own preferences, his own right to exist for purposes other than service. Linda, who raised her grandchildren while her daughter struggled with addiction, never knew when love became enablement, when helping became hurting, when the desire to protect children turned into permission for their parent to avoid responsibility. When my turn came, my voice felt rusty from disuse, like an instrument that hadn't been played in years. "My daughter called me a burden," I said, the words falling into the circle like stones into still water. And I realized I had been treating myself like one for years, trying to earn my place in her life by being useful instead of just being loved. The nods around the circle felt like warm hands on my shoulders. "Boundaries are love and structure," someone said. "You can't pour from an empty cup," said another. The phrases felt worn smooth by repetition, like river stones polished by countless hands, but underneath them lay something harder and more valuable: permission to exist fully, to need without shame, to love without erasure. I began to practice sentences that would keep me whole, words that felt foreign in my mouth, like learning a language I should have been taught decades ago. Asterisk, I love you, and I can't do that. Asterisk, I'm not available for that responsibility. Asterisk, let's schedule a time that works for both of us. Asterisk, that doesn't work for me, but here's what does. The group met every Tuesday, and I found myself looking forward to those evenings with an anticipation I hadn't felt in years. These were people who understood the difference between helping and self-sacrifice, between love and codependence, between being needed and being diminished. We shared strategies for setting boundaries that felt loving instead of punitive, for saying no without cruelty, for building lives that had room for service without requiring self-erasure. 3 weeks later, I was buying tea at the grocery store, good tea, the kind I had always thought was too expensive but had finally decided I was worth, when I turned the corner into the cereal aisle and there she was. Sarah, looking tired and somehow smaller than I remembered, was pushing a cart with Emma strapped into the front seat like a small navigator guiding their journey through the maze of everyday necessities. Emma's face lit up like a sunrise when she saw me. "Grandma." Her arms flew open in the universal gesture of a child who expects to be caught, to be celebrated, to be the center of someone's world. For a moment, the hurt receded enough to let love rush in, pure and uncomplicated. I kissed her forehead, breathed in the scent of baby shampoo and playground sand and the ineffable sweetness of someone who loves you without conditions. "Mom." Sarah's voice was careful, brittle as old paper that might crumble if handled roughly. "Can we talk? Please? Emma misses you so much." "We all do. She keeps asking when you're coming home." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. The shadows under her eyes, the way her shoulders curved inward as if carrying something too heavy for their frame. The slight tremor in her hands that spoke of exhaustion and worry and the particular terror of realizing you might have broken something you didn't know how to fix. I remembered being her age, holding her as a baby, feeling like I was drowning in the beautiful, terrible responsibility of keeping another person alive and happy and safe. The weight of it, the way it could make you say things you didn't mean, do things you never thought you would do, hurt people you loved simply because you were hurting and had nowhere else to put the pain. "I'd like that," I said, meaning it. "But not in a parking lot, and not an ambush. Call me tonight, and we'll schedule something proper. A conversation where we both have time to think and speak carefully. Can't you just come home? Just for tonight? We can order pizza, and Emma can show you her new drawings. We can pretend this whole thing never happened and just go back to normal." Normal. The word hung between us like a question mark. Normal was what had brought us here, the gradual erosion of boundaries until help became expectation, until love became obligation, until being family meant being available for unlimited emotional and domestic labor without reciprocity or recognition. The old me would have melted at Emma's bright smile, would have followed the path of least resistance back into the familiar cage of being needed. The new me, the one who had been practicing sentences and learning to value her own life, kissed Emma again and said, "I'll call you tomorrow, sweet girl. We'll make a plan to spend time together soon." "But Grandma." I love you, I said, the words carrying all the weight of absolute truth. And that's exactly why I need to do this carefully. I walked away while love and pain wrestled in my chest, while Emma called my name in the voice that had always been able to undo my resolve, while Sarah stood frozen by her cart with an expression that contained every emotion except understanding. But I walked away clean, without anger, without cruelty, with boundaries that felt less like walls and more like doors I could choose to open. The call came that evening as promised, just as I was helping Janet with dinner in her warm kitchen that smelled like rosemary and possibility. Sarah's voice was smaller than it had been in the store, younger somehow, stripped of the defensive armor she had worn in public. Mom, I need to apologize. What you heard? I was on the phone with Mark's sister, and I was drowning. Emma had been crying for hours, the daycare bill was overdue, I had 3 freelance projects with impossible deadlines, and I felt like I was failing at everything. I said something horrible because I felt horrible, and I'm so sorry. I sat at Janet's kitchen table with the phone pressed to my ear, watching late autumn light fade behind the curtains she had sewn herself from fabric that reminded her of her grandmother's garden. The apology was genuine, but apologies alone don't rebuild bridges that have been burned by careless words and careful neglect. Thank you for apologizing, I said. But Sarah, what you said wasn't wrong because it hurt my feelings. It was wrong because it wasn't true. And the fact that you felt comfortable saying it, even in a moment of stress, tells me something important about how we've been living together. I don't want you to hate me. I could never hate you. But I can't go back to the way things were, not because I want to punish you, but because it wasn't working for either of us. It was making you resentful and me invisible, and that's not what love looks like. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 3 years of good intentions that had curdled into something neither of us had wanted but both of us had accepted as normal. Finally, Sarah's voice came through the phone, smaller and more honest than it had been in months. What do you want from me? What do I need to do to fix this? I want us to learn how to love each other without drowning, I said. I want to be your mother, not your employee. I want to help when you ask, not when you assume. I want Emma to have a grandmother who is whole and happy, not someone who disappears into service. We agreed to meet the next day at the kitchen table where this had all begun, the same table where I had stirred honey into tea while learning I was unwanted, where Emma had eaten countless bowls of cereal while I packed her lunches and brushed her hair and tried to fill the spaces left by absence and exhaustion. Sarah made coffee the next morning, real coffee from beans she had ground herself, not the instant kind we had been drinking to save money. We sat across from each other like diplomats negotiating a peace treaty, 2 women who had loved each other imperfectly and needed to learn how to do better. I told her exactly what I had heard, word for word, without embellishment or interpretation. She flinched but didn't deny it, didn't minimize it, didn't ask me to understand the context that might make it acceptable. She owned it completely, the way you own a debt you know you have to pay. I said it, she whispered, tears starting to track down her cheeks. I was drowning, and instead of asking for help, I blamed you for needing help too. I made you responsible for problems that weren't yours to solve, and then I resented you for not solving them perfectly. Her honesty was a gift I hadn't expected, more valuable than any apology because it showed she understood not just what she had done, but why it was wrong. I reached across the table and touched her hand, feeling the calluses from her graphic design work, the small burns from learning to cook for a family, the tremor of someone who had been carrying too much for too long. I forgive you, I said, meaning it completely. And I also can't come back to live here. Not because I'm angry, but because we both need something different. We need to learn how to love each other without losing ourselves. I laid out new terms with the same careful precision I had once used to fold fitted sheets, to organize closets, to manage the invisible infrastructure of domestic life. I would not be the default childcare provider. I would not manage household crises that weren't mine to solve. Help would be scheduled, not assumed. Emergencies would be defined clearly and narrowly. We would both build wider support networks so that our love didn't have to carry the weight it was never meant to bear. What if I can't do it alone? Sarah asked, her voice small and scared. Then we figure out what help looks like, I said. Childcare swaps with neighbors. Therapy for the postpartum depression you haven't named yet, but that I can see in your eyes. Community resources. Friends who can share the load. A nanny or babysitter for the hours you need to work. I want to be your mother, not your solution to every problem. But what if I fail? What if I can't handle it? Then you'll learn, the way every parent does. The way I had to learn when you were small, and your father worked long hours, and my mother lived 3 states away. You'll make mistakes and figure it out and ask for help from multiple people instead of expecting one person to be everything you need. Sarah cried then, tears that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than guilt or fear. I was so scared of becoming like you, she whispered. Giving up everything for everyone else, disappearing into motherhood and marriage and service. And instead, I made you give up everything for me. The truth hung between us like a bridge we could choose to cross or burn. I understood then that she hadn't just been using me, she had been afraid of me, afraid of the cautionary tale she thought my life represented. In trying not to become the woman who sacrificed everything for family, she had demanded that I continue being that woman for her. I don't want you to become like me, I said. I want you to become like the woman I'm learning to be now, someone who can love generously without disappearing, who can help without enabling, who can be a mother without forgetting she's also a person. The conversation lasted 3 hours, coffee growing cold and then being replaced with tea, then with the sandwiches Sarah made while we talked, our words finding their way around bites of bread and the simple act of sharing food that no one had to prepare alone. By the time I left, we had a plan that felt both realistic and revolutionary. Scheduled visits instead of constant availability. Shared activities instead of assumed labor. Boundaries that protected both of us from the resentment that grows when love becomes lopsided, when generosity becomes exploitation, when being family becomes an excuse for taking without giving. I found an apartment the next week, a small converted carriage house behind a larger home where an elderly couple named Rose and Frank had lived for 40 years. One room with high ceilings and windows that faced east toward morning light, a kitchenette just big enough for one person who enjoyed cooking for pleasure instead of obligation, a bathroom with a deep tub and room for the plants I wanted to try growing. Rose and Frank had coffee with me on Sundays and shared stories about their grandchildren who lived in different states, who called once a week and visited twice a year, who sent pictures and birthday cards and love that traveled well across distances. They understood that family could be close without being consuming, that love could be constant without being demanding. We raised our children to leave us, Rose told me one morning as we sat on their back porch watching finches argue over the bird feeder Frank had built. Not because we didn't want them around, but because we wanted them to be whole people with their own lives. The best gift you can give a child is showing them what it looks like to be a complete person. I furnished my small space slowly, deliberately, choosing each piece with the kind of care I had never been able to give to my own comfort. A small table painted blue like the morning sky. 2 chairs, in case someone wanted to join me, but not so many that I felt obligated to entertain. A reading lamp that cast warm circles on the wall where I hung photographs of places I wanted to visit, books I wanted to read again, and art that spoke to something in me that had been silent for too long. For the first time in years, I had a space that was entirely mine, that reflected my preferences without compromise or negotiation. The books on my shelves were books I had chosen, not books that looked impressive or educational for Emma. The kitchen held spices I liked, tea that tasted like comfort, and food that nourished me instead of fulfilling someone else's expectations. I joined the volunteer program at the library, reading to children on Saturday mornings who gathered around the story circle like flowers turning toward the sun. Their faces were bright with attention, unburdened by the complicated mathematics of adult relationships. They wanted stories, and I had stories to tell, and the exchange felt clean and joyful in a way that reminded me why I had wanted to work with children in the first place. I took a ceramics class at the community center and discovered that my hands remembered how to create beauty from clay, how to shape something useful and lovely from raw material and patient attention. The wheel spun beneath my palms, and I learned to center Clay the way I was learning to center myself, finding the balance point where pressure and gentleness created stability instead of collapse. Slowly, intentionally, I built a life that was mine, not in reaction to being unwanted, but in response to finally understanding what I wanted. The support group became a chosen family of sorts, people who understood the difference between helping and self-erasure, between love and codependence, between being needed and being valued. We shared strategies and setbacks, celebrated small victories, and mourned the relationships that couldn't survive the introduction of healthy boundaries. Some of us were learning to love better, others were learning to leave situations that couldn't be fixed. All of us were learning that our worth wasn't dependent on our usefulness to others. Emma came to visit on scheduled Saturday afternoons, and we had tea parties in my small space where she was the undisputed center of attention for exactly as long as we had agreed upon. She helped me plant marigolds in the small garden patch that came with my apartment, and she learned to roll clay into snakes that we turned into tiny bowls for her dollhouse. "This is Grandma's house," she would tell her mother when Sarah came to pick her up, and I marveled at how much love could live in 300 square feet when it wasn't burdened by resentment or expectation. Emma knew she was welcome here, but she also knew this space belonged to me, that I existed as a person beyond my role as her grandmother. Sarah came too, sometimes, for carefully orchestrated visits that had beginning and ending times clearly established in advance. We were learning each other again, discovering who we were when we weren't locked in the exhausting dance of giver and taker, helper and helped, mother and burden. She started therapy, as I had suggested, and began to untangle the postpartum depression that had been coloring her world gray for months. She joined a new mothers group and discovered other women who understood the weight of raising children without enough support. She hired a babysitter for 2 evenings a week so she could remember she existed outside of motherhood, that she had interests and dreams that didn't revolve around Emma's needs. "I'm learning to ask for help," she told me one afternoon as we sat in my small garden watching Emma chase butterflies between the marigold plants. "Real help, from multiple people, instead of making one person responsible for everything I need." Love is supposed to be distributed, I thought, watching my granddaughter's face light up as a butterfly landed briefly on her outstretched finger. Asterisk not concentrated until it becomes too heavy for anyone to carry. 6 months after I walked out of Sarah's kitchen, I hosted my first holiday gathering in my small space. Janet brought her famous green bean casserole and helped me arrange borrowed tables in configurations that maximized conversation. Margaret and David came with flowers and stories about their own journeys toward healthier relationships with their families. Rose and Frank provided extra chairs and homemade rolls that filled my apartment with the scent of yeast and warmth. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter that cost no one their peace. These were people who had learned to love without losing themselves, who understood that healthy relationships required boundaries, who knew the difference between helping and enabling. We told stories, shared recipes, and celebrated the quiet victory of building lives that belonged to us. Sarah and Emma arrived at 4 o'clock, as scheduled, for dessert and a present exchange. Emma ran between the adults like a small ambassador, charming everyone with her questions about their lives, their families, and their favorite flowers. She showed off the pottery skills she had learned in my Saturday afternoon classes, explaining the glazing process to Margaret with the confidence of someone who knew her knowledge was valued. Sarah brought homemade cookies and seemed to actually relax, laughing at Frank's terrible jokes and asking Rose for her biscuit recipe. She fit easily into my chosen family, not because she was performing or trying to prove anything, but because she was learning to be comfortable in spaces that didn't revolve around her needs or problems. At 6 o'clock, they left with hugs and promises to call soon. No guilt, no lingering expectations, no sense that anyone was giving more than they could afford or taking more than was offered. Emma carried a small pottery bowl she had made in my class, painted bright yellow like sunshine, and Sarah carried the phone number of a babysitter Rose had recommended. After everyone went home, I sat in my small space surrounded by the pleasant debris of successful hospitality, crumb-covered plates, wine glasses with lipstick traces, the lingering scent of cinnamon and connection. Janet helped me wash dishes while Rose packaged leftovers for me to take to the volunteers at the community center. This is what love looks like when it's healthy, Janet said, drying a plate with the careful attention she gave to everything she valued. Distributed, voluntary, and sustainable. That night, I wrote in the journal I had started keeping, not to process pain, but to record joy, to document the small daily victories of a life lived on my own terms. I wrote about Emma's laughter, Sarah's genuine smile, the way my chosen family had filled my small space with warmth without anyone feeling obligated or resentful. I wrote about the woman I was becoming, someone who could love generously without disappearing, who could help without enabling, who could be needed without being diminished. Someone who understood that being called a burden by one person didn't make it true, especially when so many others saw my worth clearly and celebrated it freely. The seasons turned like pages in a book I was writing myself. Spring brought daffodils in the small garden, and I remembered painting Sarah's kitchen that same soft yellow, back when I thought love meant making myself useful enough to be kept. Now I knew love meant being cherished for who you are, not what you can provide. Emma learned to ride a bike in the park near my apartment, and I ran alongside her, both of us laughing when she wobbled and cheering when she found her balance. Sarah took pictures from the bench where she sat with her new friend from the mother's group, another single parent who understood the weight of doing it alone and the joy of discovering you don't have to. Mom, Sarah said that day as we packed up the picnic, I want you to know something. Your leaving was the best thing you could have done for both of us. I was drowning, and instead of learning to swim, I was pulling you under with me. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to drown together. The words came from somewhere deep, truth distilled into language that could be carried forward, shared with other people who were struggling to understand the difference between love and self-sacrifice, between helping and hurting. On the anniversary of the day I walked out, I wrote letters. Not angry letters, not blame letters, but love letters, to myself for finding the courage to leave, to Sarah for learning to ask for help properly, to Emma for being the bright thread that kept us connected even when the fabric of our family needed rewinding. I wrote to every woman who has ever been called a burden for having needs, for aging, for becoming inconvenient to people who once needed them desperately. I wrote to every person who has given until they forgot what they wanted, who has loved until they lost themselves, who has confused being useful with being valued. You are not a burden for existing, for aging, for needing care and consideration. I wrote. You are not required to earn your place in the world through constant service. Love should add to your life, not subtract from it. Boundaries are doors with your name on the key, and you get to choose who walks through. The letter became a speech I gave at the community center, then at the senior center, then at a conference for caregivers, where I was invited to talk about sustainable love and the difference between helping and enabling. The response was always the same, tears of recognition, nods of understanding, and the question asked in a dozen different ways: how do you know when it's time to leave? How do you know when love has become a cage? You know because you start to disappear, I would answer. You know, because your needs become negotiable while everyone else's become demands. You know, because you're walking on eggshells in your own life, afraid that who you are naturally is too much, too expensive, too burdensome to bear. The second anniversary passed quietly. Sarah sent flowers, not expensive ones, but daffodils from her garden, bright and simple in a mason jar with a note that read, Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't mean losing yourself. Thank you for showing Emma what it looks like when someone knows their worth. Emma, now 5 and gloriously articulate, called that evening to tell me about her day at preschool, about the caterpillar she found in the garden, about the song she learned that she wanted to sing for me on Saturday. Her voice was bright and unencumbered by the adult weight of managing relationships, and I marveled at how children can love simply when the adults around them love healthily. The best gift you can give a child is showing them what it looks like to be a whole person, I wrote in my journal that night. Not a person fragmented by obligation, not a person diminished by service, but someone who knows their worth and protects it with gentle firmness. I thought about my own mother, how she had carried the word burden like inherited jewelry, passing it down to me with the same unconscious certainty that brown eyes follow blue. She had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from hers, a legacy of women taught that their value lay in their usefulness, their lovability and their willingness to disappear into other people's needs. But legacy chains can be broken. Stories can be rewritten. The word burden could end with me instead of being passed to Emma like some terrible heirloom that would shape her understanding of her own worth. At 70, I started teaching pottery classes at the community center, my hands guiding others to discover what could be made from clay when you approached it with patience and hope. My students ranged from teenagers looking for college credit to seniors exploring creative retirement, all of us learning to center clay the way we were learning to center ourselves. The clay teaches you, I would tell them as they struggled with pieces that wobbled or collapsed. It tells you what it wants to become. Your job is to listen and guide, not force. Pressure without patience creates cracks. Gentleness without structure creates collapse. You need both. The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone. We were all learning to listen to what we wanted to become, to guide ourselves with the same gentle attention we gave to clay on the wheel, to find the balance between structure and flow that created beauty instead of breakdown. Sarah brought Emma to the pottery studio sometimes, and I watched my granddaughter discover the joy of creation without pressure, the satisfaction of making something beautiful just because she could. Her small hands shaped lopsided bowls that we fired and glazed with colors she chose herself, bright yellows and deep blues and the soft green of new leaves. "Will you teach me to make plates for my dollhouse?" she asked one Saturday, her face serious with artistic intention. "We'll make a whole set," I promised. Tiny plates for tiny tea parties. Love is supposed to create, not diminish. Love should add beauty to the world, not subtract it. The community center asked me to write a handbook for their caregiver support program, and I found myself documenting everything I had learned about the difference between helping and enabling, between love and codependence, between being needed and being diminished. Page by page, I recorded the hard-won wisdom of women and men who had loved too much in all the wrong ways and were learning to love better. Healthy Help, I called it, a guide to loving without losing yourself. The pages are filled with practical advice and emotional insights, how to recognize when generosity becomes exploitation, how to set boundaries that feel loving instead of punitive, how to build support networks that distribute care instead of concentrating it on one person until they break. But mostly, I wrote about worth, how to remember it when the world tells you you're too much or not enough, how to protect it when people who claim to love you treat it as negotiable, how to rebuild it when years of putting others first have eroded your sense of self until you can't remember what you wanted before you learned to want what others needed. The book was published by a small press that specialized in life transitions and aging with dignity. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found its way to people who needed it. Women leaving marriages where they had become invisible, adult children learning to care for aging parents without sacrificing themselves, people of all ages discovering that love didn't require self-erasure to be real. I received letters from readers who recognized themselves in my story, who found permission in my pages to value their own lives as much as they valued others. A daughter in Seattle who moved her mother into assisted living instead of her spare bedroom, recognizing that professional care was better than a resentful family obligation. A son in Miami who hired home health aides instead of quitting his job to become a full-time caregiver, learning that love could be expressed through wise choices rather than personal sacrifice. The word selfish is often used to shame people for having boundaries, I wrote in response to one particularly poignant letter. But there's nothing selfish about refusing to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Self-preservation is not selfishness, it's the foundation that makes love sustainable. Years passed like pages turning in a book whose ending I was finally allowed to write. Emma grew tall and confident, a child who knew she was loved without conditions, who understood that the adults in her life were whole people with their own needs and dreams. She helped me in the garden, learned to throw pottery on the wheel, and asked thoughtful questions about why people sometimes hurt each other, even when they love each other. Sometimes people don't know how to love without hurting, I told her one afternoon as we harvested tomatoes from the vines Rose had helped me plant. They think love means never saying no, never having boundaries, never disappointing anyone. But that kind of love makes everyone sad eventually because it's not really love, it's fear wearing a love costume. Is that why you moved out of our house? she asked, her 8-year-old directness cutting straight to the truth with the kind of clarity adults spend years learning to appreciate. Yes, sweetheart. I moved out because I love you and your mom too much to stay where it was making us all unhappy. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is change the situation instead of just enduring it. She nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the wisdom children possess before the world teaches them that love should be complicated, that sacrifice should be expected, that boundaries should be shameful. Sarah visited monthly now, sometimes bringing Emma, sometimes coming alone for the kind of mother-daughter conversations we had never been able to have when our relationship was tangled up in obligation and resentment and the exhausting logistics of shared living. She had finished her degree, started working part-time as a graphic designer, and begun dating a man who understood that loving someone meant supporting their other relationships, not consuming all their energy. I used to be jealous of your new life, she admitted one autumn evening as we sat on my small porch watching the leaves change color in the early darkness. It seemed like you were so much happier without us, like we had been holding you back all those years. I'm happier without the old arrangement, I corrected gently. I've always been happy with you. But I couldn't be happy for you when loving you cost me myself, when being your mother meant forgetting how to be a person. I understand that now. I think I'm finally learning the difference between being needed and being loved, between helping and controlling, between caring for someone and managing their life. We sat in comfortable silence, two women who had learned to love each other without drowning, without diminishing, without keeping score or maintaining ledgers of who owed what to whom. The evening air carried the scent of Rose's late-blooming roses and the sound of Frank calling his cat home for dinner, the peaceful soundtrack of a life lived at a sustainable pace. At 75, I wrote my final letter, not to Sarah or Emma, not to the readers who had found comfort in my story, but to you, whoever you are, reading this now with recognition in your chest, wondering if you, too, are allowed to choose yourself without apology. If your love has become a ledger where you're always in debt, you are allowed to close the account and begin again. If you're walking on eggshells in your own life, afraid that your authentic self is too much, too expensive, too burdensome to bear, you are allowed to step firmly and make noise. If someone has called you a burden for having needs, for aging, for being inconveniently human, you are allowed to let that word belong to them instead of carrying it as truth about your worth. Leaving can be an act of love, for yourself and for those who need to learn that love doesn't mean ownership, that care doesn't mean control, that being family doesn't mean being available for unlimited emotional labor without reciprocity or recognition. You are not a burden for existing. You are not required to earn your place in the world through constant service. Your worth is not dependent on your usefulness to others. Asterisk boundaries are doors with your name on the key, and you get to choose who walks through. The morning I finished writing this, Emma called to tell me she had gotten into art school, the same program I had wanted to attend at her age but couldn't because being a burden meant being practical, because dreams were luxuries that responsible people couldn't afford. She was 19 now, bright and confident and unafraid of taking up space in the world, of wanting things for herself, of believing she deserved to pursue what made her happy. Will you come to my graduation exhibition? She asked, her voice bubbling with excitement and artistic ambition. I'm doing a series on intergenerational trauma and healing. It's about cycles being broken and stories being rewritten, about the courage it takes to choose yourself. I wouldn't miss it, I promised, my heart full of pride for this young woman who would never be told she was too much, never be taught to shrink herself to fit other people's comfort zones, never carry the word burden like an inherited curse. That afternoon, I sat in my garden with tea in a mug Emma had made for me in pottery class, imperfect, beautiful, glazed the color of early morning sky. The daffodils were blooming again, their bright faces turned toward spring sunshine, persistent in their return despite winter's attempts to diminish them. I thought about the woman who had stood in Sarah's kitchen 6 years ago, stirring honey into tea while learning she was unwanted. She could never have imagined this life, this peace, this purpose, this love that adds instead of subtracts. She could never have believed that walking away would lead to walking toward, that leaving would teach everyone how to love better. But courage rarely shows us the destination when it asks us to take the first step. It only promises that moving forward is better than staying still, that truth is better than pretense, that honoring yourself teaches others how to honor you too. The tea was perfect, sweet enough, strong enough, mine to enjoy without apology or explanation. Somewhere across town, Sarah was probably picking up Emma from her part-time job at the bookstore, and they would have dinner together, and Emma would tell her mother about her day, and Sarah would listen with the kind of attention that comes naturally when you're not exhausted from giving more than you have. Tonight, they might call me, or they might not. Either way would be fine, because love that is freely given and freely received doesn't demand constant contact to prove its existence. It trusts in its own strength, in its ability to weather seasons and silence, in its commitment to the long story rather than the immediate moment. I finished my tea as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of forgiveness and new beginnings. Tomorrow I will teach pottery to a new group of students learning to shape clay with patience and hope. Tomorrow I would tend the garden that bloomed because I had learned to tend myself. Tomorrow, I will continue the quiet work of living a life that belongs to me, fully and without apology. If this story found you at the right time, share it with someone who needs it. Pass along the permission to choose yourself, to love without losing yourself, to understand that being called a burden by one person doesn't make it true, especially when you know, deep in your bones, that you are worthy of love that adds to your life instead of subtracting from it.